Hello, and welcome to my review of the first edition of Macchiato Monsters, a OSR game by Eric Nieudan. And this game, as you can see, was first released in its Zero edition in 2016. That edition I used to design a module for Gauntlet Codex, the Gauntlet community zine called To the Halls of the Stormlord. I'm hoping to bring that out in independent form, publish that in independent form in the near future. But that just goes to say that I have some experience with this module going quite a ways back. With the system going quite a ways back. Over the last month, I've been playing a lot of Macchiato Monsters. I'm still playing it this month. I think over these 2 months, in terms of prep and playing, GMing, I probably spent, upwards of 60 hours with this system. So I feel like I'm in a pretty good position to provide a preliminary review. There are some aspects of the game that I have not really touched on in play yet, and I will highlight those. So this is not a complete review, but for the core system, the core rules, I feel like I've got quite a bit of experience here and definitely have quite a bit to say. So let's get started with it. So to begin with, I think there is just a few overview things to say about the game. So I'd first of all say that this is a game that is about moderation in all things. That seems like really the design principle behind this game. It's called Macchiato Monsters because it's kind of a combination of the best parts of the black hack and the white hack. Two different OSR games that are quite popular. But I also feel like that sort of spirit of synthesis and moderation really permeates this whole game. In some ways, it's crunchier than a lot of other OSR games out there, but in some ways it's less crunchy than other OSR games out there. There's more to character creation. It's more involved than a lot of other OSR games. However, it's a lot less than another game that was inspired by the OSR, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And it has a little bit of a wacky side to it, but it's not as wacky as something like Troika. So there's really a kind of golden mean principle to the design throughout this whole game. And I like that a lot because I think that it makes the system very versatile. It gives it a lot of nuance, but it never feels overwhelming, at least for myself. So to get into the details of the game, we start out with this first section, Welcome to the Dungeonverse. So this is the overview of the game. It gives us a little outline of the principles of old school gaming or of the OSR, and it mentions these ones here. So first of all, there's rulings over rules. So generally speaking, it's just giving you a framework to play with. It's not trying to elaborate every situation in the rules like you would find in, say, Pathfinder. No, it's very light, very vague, very broad, and the GM and the players are going to fill in the specifics as they play. It's focused on player intelligence, which means that players face challenges with their own smarts, not with the superpowers on their character sheets. So again, this is very different from latter-day D&D or Pathfinder or Supers games, in that your characters are quite disempowered, but the decisions you make in the game as a player do significantly affect the direction of play in a way that they might not in more restricted games. So there is a lot of tactical thinking, even though there are not a lot of tactical rules. That's where the rules, sort of the rulings over rules principle is very important. Another one, resource management. This is a game that I think really excels at handling resource management. Resource management is a thing that is a part of a lot of games out there. Certainly OSR games, but there's a sort of perfunctory survival and wilderness travel, overland travel kind of system in something like 5e. But oftentimes, even like in Dungeon World or whatever, there's a nod to this kind of stuff. But oftentimes in real play, that stuff just kind of gets swept under the rug or brushed aside because you're like, well, that's not really the substance of the game. I'm not that interested in that. There's nothing too much going on there. It's just a bunch of accounting work. And what Macchiato Monsters does that's brilliant is it adds a certain amount of chance and randomness to that accounting work. And it adds a level of interesting decisions, push your luck principles, and all that sort of thing to your resource management. So it feels like a dynamic, living aspect of play instead of just being, numbers on a sheet that get whittled down and then you have to refresh them, stocks and flows, blah, blah, blah. It's in many games quite tiresome and often abandoned, but that really does not feel like how it works in Macchiato Monsters, and I appreciate that a great deal. The next principle is deadly fights. So I would not say that Macchiato Monsters is the most lethal game I've played. There's certainly more lethal games out there, but PC death happens quite a bit, especially depending on the module. And it's handled in such a way that the characters you create have a personality and you feel a certain amount of attachment and interest in them. That's a little different than, say, a character funnel. But the risk of them dying is always there. And when they do die, it usually doesn't feel aggravating. It just feels like, oh, that's kind of how things went, right? Like it's a little bit out of your hands. And it's really treading a very fine line here between having very disposable characters and having characters that you're so attached to that their death would be very frustrating. So, for example, again, I keep coming back to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but I feel like that's really the touchstone for this sort of game. So in that game, there's quite high lethality for PCs at level 1, to the point that many campaigns will just skip straight to level 3, because losing a PC in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is really quite bothersome because the creation is so involved that losing that work and going back and recreating everything, it feels exhausting. It doesn't feel exhausting in my experience in Macchiato Monsters, but it is definitely on the heavier end of character creation compared to many OSR games. So most of the time when you die in this game, it will be in combat. There are, of course, other ways to die. I had one character in a game I ran who just died of a heart attack because the labor they were trying to do was too strenuous. Just boom, lost some hit points, and that was it. But yes, it's not a combat-focused game. It's not a game of quote-unquote tactical combat. It is a game of tactical thinking, certainly, but if you can avoid combat, that's probably the best way to go. And I think that leads to a lot more interesting dungeon ecology, a lot more interesting PC interactions, and a lot more interesting player level thinking than you get in a combat focused dungeon crawling game. Of course, there's interesting dungeon crawling games that are combat focused, is like Gloomhaven and stuff. That stuff's cool, but this is its own beast, is very interesting in itself. The final principle here is to embrace randomness, and I feel like this is really where Macchiato Monsters excels. It makes heavy use of risk dice, something which was pioneered, I believe, in the Black Hack. But it uses them so much more extensively than the Black Hack, and it means that as the GM, you are going to be doing a lot of rolling. Things are going to feel very procedurally generated, but it gives you really interesting results, and it feels like as the GM, you are an active player of the game. You are not just somebody there, or I guess I should say as the referee, right? Because that's what OSR games call the GM. So yes, as the referee, you're an active player. You're not just somebody there handing down story bits, or somebody reacting with improv to predefined moves like you might have in a PBTA game. So yeah, that is a very interesting aspect of play. It really keeps you on your toes as a GM, but it's very fun. So the next section to talk about here are the core mechanics. And so kind of going to go through this quite quickly. This game is a roll under system. You roll a d20 and you try to roll under your stat. It's different than some games where you're trying to roll high. So that's something to note. It just makes things quite simple and fast. This is a game that makes extensive use of advantage and disadvantage. Again, you may be familiar with these from 5e. They work pretty much the same here. Risk dice, I've already mentioned, but I can give you a little rundown. They're really used to maximum effect here, and you're going to go from a d12 down to a d4. And every time you roll a 1 to 3 on a die, it steps down one die type. So a d12 will become a d10, a d10 will become a d8, a d8 will become a d6, a d6 will become a d4, and if you roll 1 to 3 on a d4, then it's effectively spent. So if you're tracking a resource, that means that your resource is gone. You run out of food, you run out of ammo, you run out of water, whatever you have. You run out of morale, right? Any of those things. So it says here, usually a 1 to 3 means an escalation of the risk, and the maximum number is a lucky break. You can assume a 3 is better than a 2, which is not as bad as a 1. Keep this in mind when you need to interpret the result for a risk die you just made up, or if you don't have a right table handy. So you can use this free form. If you roll like, a 6 on a d6, maybe it'll step up to a d8, right? If you roll an 8 on a d8, maybe it'll go up to d10. If you roll 1 to 3, it's going to step down. And there are many tables in this game to help you make on-the-fly fast decisions for using these risk dice. So, making a character. This is, as I said, quite a bit more involved than some games out there. It definitely provokes a lot of thinking among players as they kind of try to zero in on what sort of character they want to end up with as they're sort of negotiating the randomness of the process and the choices they have available. So how does it work? Well, you have your 6 standard stats, strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma. Everybody knows them. They're from D&D. Okay. You roll 3d6 for each, and you can swap any 2 stats you like. I usually let the players go back and do this again after they have rolled up their equipment and figured out their choices, because then they have a better idea of what they want to be their high stats, what they want to be their low stats. The next thing to do is to invent a trait. Now, a trait covers all of these things that might have separate categories in other games. It could be your race, right? Elf or dwarf or whatever. It could be a lizard person, any kind of thing. It could be your occupation. I've had a watchmaker in one of my games that was really cool. It could be your background, you're from a certain background, like you might have in 5e, right? And faction, again, maybe 5e, I'm from the Harpers, right? You could do that, totally. I'm from the Zentarum, any of those kinds of things. The next thing to do is to just record your hit die. It starts at a d6. So you just roll it for your hit points, and you can have 1 to 6 hit points to start out with. Very low, but you get to make some choices to modify that. So the next part is where it really gets interesting. You get to choose 2 bonuses from a list. You can add a d6 to a stat that's 10 or less, so you can bump up a stat. Remember, you also have the choice to switch stats once. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there. You can write down another trait for your character. So say, I'm a member of the Zentarum, and I'm also an elf, right? Those are the things you can do. I'll talk a little bit more about traits as we go on. You can gain an additional hit die of the same type, so you can go from 1d6 to 2d6. You can take a martial training. This is where it starts to get really interesting. You step up your hit die. So if you start with a d6, right? If you step up your hit die, you go to a d8. Now you can, after you take that d8, also take an additional hit die of the same type, so you can have 2d8 HP max to start with. You can have 1d10 max or 2d8 max, depending on your choices. The martial training is very interesting because it also improves the weapons you can use. In this game, if your weapon does more damage than your hit die type, you can only attack with it at disadvantage. So if you take martial training once, then you can use effectively a weapon that does up to 1d8 damage. If you take martial training twice, you can use a weapon that does up to 1d10 damage. However, that means you're going to be suffering in terms of your hit points, your stats, your traits, all your other things. So there's a lot of interesting choices to make here. Your martial training will also unlock the possibility of taking extra melee or ranged attacks when you advance. So when you level up effectively. Next, there's specialist training. So specialist training is also quite interesting. It gives you a daily ability. And usually this daily ability will allow you to avoid a check, but it's something specific, right? I had one player who chose the daily ability Eagle-Eyed, right? That was their specialist training. So it allowed them to spot things effectively. They could only do that for free without rolling once per day. But once you get a level up in specialist training, you get an extra use of that ability plus an extra one that you can use once a day. So that gives you a lot of strong fictional positioning and also tactical possibilities in play that are not prescribed by any preset skill lists or rules. It's just a conversation you have between the referee and the players, and you come up with it together, what seems fair. That's what it means to do rulings over rules. The final type of advance you can take is the magic training. This lets you come up with 2 spells, and I'll get into how spells work a little bit more later in this review, because it's quite interesting in itself, and really needs to be dealt with elsewhere. Now, when you roll your hit die, if you don't like the result, you can spend a point of Constitution. You lose it permanently to re-roll. Now, that might seem like a really bad deal, but remember, you can add d6 to a stat. So, say that your Constitution is an 8. Well, if you rolled a 6 on that, then you would go up to a Constitution of 14, and you could spend 1 Constitution to re-roll your hit die. So, given how lethal this game is, sometimes it is worth spending those Constitution points. In practice, I find that players generally don't tend to do that, but if you actually look at the risk-reward, it isn't a bad idea at all. And then we go on to getting languages. You basically use your int, wisdom, and charisma, and you roll a d20 for each of them. If you roll under your stat on any of them, you get 1 language for each success. Usually I like to do this on the fly when we're playing, like, oh, you encounter some elves, oh, do you know Elven? Okay, like, roll the die, one of the ones you haven't used yet, and if you succeed, then you can speak their language. If you fail, then you can't. That tends to be more effective than deciding in advance, because, you know, you could pick Draconic and then there's no dragons or kobolds or anything to encounter in the module, and it's just a big bummer. Finally, you roll for equipment. And this is really important. It decides a lot about your character, and it is quite involved in itself. So, there's a little overview here of what stats do. There's nothing too unusual. They basically do what they do in most, D&D influenced games. And the sort of highlights here are that Constitution has no direct influence on your hit points. As we saw, you can just spend points of Constitution to re-roll if your hit die roll really was bad, right? So it's an indirect influence instead of a direct one. Another thing worth noting is that intelligence, wisdom, and charisma can all be casting stats, so that's similar to D&D 5th edition. You just talk about it with your referee about which one you think is applicable for your character. And then finally, charisma can function as a luck stat. That is, again, up to the referee's discretion. You might just roll a die of fate, like roll a d6, see if it's high or low if you want to see luck. But, you know, if you want to say your character has luck, like they are a lucky person or not, then you can use charisma to make those decisions instead. And, you know, that's also done in many other OSR games. So there's nothing too interesting to say about the stats. They're just the D&D stats. So now let's talk about the traits. So as I mentioned, these can be your character's like race or species or whatever. It could be their occupation, it could be their background, it could be the faction they belong to. And basically, if it's relevant to the situation, you can get advantage. It's not as strong as having specialist training, but it is able to, you can use it more than once per rest. So that is quite useful. And traits are not used for combat. Right, so you can't say I'm a Minotaur, so I always get advantage in combat. No, that doesn't fly. You can also get disadvantage because of a trait. Like it says here, for example, if you're a known thief and you're negotiating with the Brotherhood of Written Law, you're probably going to be at disadvantage. So it can work to your advantage, it can work to your disadvantage, but generally speaking, you can probably use it to your advantage. I already talked about martial training. I already talked about specialist training, magic training, languages, and now we come down to the random starting equipment. So the way this works out is that you have a spread of 1d20, 1d12, 1d10, 1d8, 1d6, 1d4. And you get to spend those dice on the categories you are interested in. So the categories you want to get better stuff in, you are going to assign higher dice to. And you need to make that assignment, roll, see what the result is. You can't roll your dice, see what the high results are, and then assign those to the categories you like. It's assign first, then roll. So that makes it a little riskier and a little more interesting. So what are the categories? There are a number of them, and they all have their own sort of characteristics. So equipment and food is the first one, and it gives you more stuff per roll, like per die you assign to it. But this is actually balanced out because if you pick everything from equipment and food, your character is going to be over encumbered. So the encumbrance actually balances this out. Another thing to note about this is that there are no generic rations, and there's no like generic stuff like adventurer's kit. Like you don't have that in this game. It's very specific stuff, and it's often not the kinds of things that you would expect adventurers to have. There's a lot of sort of wacky things here that really help to bring out the flavor of the character, but they also make it quite a bit more difficult to do dungeoneering because you don't have stuff like a 10-foot pole. You don't have stuff like rope necessarily. So that can lead to a lot of creative thinking in play because you just don't have those old defaults and like standards to rely on to deal with situations in a dungeon. The next category is wealth and valuables. This can be quite useful depending on your starting situation. If you are in a situation where you have no access to a market, you're probably not going to get too much value out of this, although you may have opportunities to barter with somebody in a dungeon. And I've seen those go quite interesting directions. It is really just like, if you start in a fort or something, investing in wealth and valuables can be quite good because, as I said, the equipment table, the tools and equipment table, equipment and food table is not going to give you necessarily the best stuff. You may get better value by investing in wealth and valuables and then spending that to get the equipment that you think is going to be the most useful when you're out there adventuring. The next category is melee weapons. There's just a couple things to note about melee weapons. Two-handed weapons give advantage to damage, and high damage weapons are restricted by martial training. I already discussed that. As I said, there's a little bit of a back and forth that can happen here because you might say, oh, I'm not going to take martial training, but then I go and roll my melee weapon and I happen to roll a D8 weapon, but I won't be able to use that if I don't take martial training, so I'm going to go back and take martial training so then I can use the weapon I rolled. There's a lot of sort of like moving through the character creation process and then going back and revising. And that's where I think this game is maybe a little bit, or I should say considerably slower than some OSR games to get going. Compared to something like Knave, this is a much more involved system. But, for players who really enjoy the character creation process in games like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition or, say, Pathfinder, or 13th Age even, this isn't going to give you the super intense planning process of I want these stats so I can get these skills, so I can get these masteries, blah blah blah. I'm going to plan my character out to level 20. There's none of that, but there is a considerable amount of thinking involved in character creation that players of those games may enjoy. So I thought that was quite interesting. So another category is armor. There's not too much to say about armor. It basically soaks damage for you. But compared to some other games, its value is restricted by a durability risk die. So the risk die for your armor is going to determine how much damage it can soak for you, but it's also going to determine how durable it is. If you roll a 1 to 3 on your armor roll, then that armor is actually going to step down in terms of quality. So that and you make the roll at the time that you get hit, not before, not when combat starts. So it's like, oh, I got hit, I rolled a 1 to 3. Obviously, my armor was damaged, and now I'm down to the next step on my die, or my armor's just broken and it needs to be repaired. Missile weapons. The things to say about this. One thing that's quite interesting here is that black powder weapons, so guns and so on, are more interesting and they're more common here than in many OSR games. And I find this kind of gives the game a little bit more of an 18th century vibe compared to the, like, say, Renaissance vibe that a lot of D&D based games go for. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. And I find that in games where characters have black powder weapons, the play tends to actually focus on those quite a bit, because once you've spent your ammunition, once you run out of powder, then you need to find some more, because those weapons are so strong. You're strongly motivated to go and seek out some way, some scheme to try to get some more powder, even if the module doesn't necessarily have it out of the gate. So that leads to a lot of interesting play there. And I think that's something notable about the missile weapons in this game. Next, we go on to magical trinkets. These are used when casting spells to avoid taking HP damage. And because normally casting spells in this game will cost you HP. These magical trinkets can only be used if you do not take faith. So essentially, this breaks the game down into arcane casters versus divine casters, right? If you are an arcane caster, if you take magic training, but you don't take a faith item, then you can use magical trinkets, and that's probably going to give you a chance at more spell casting than what a faith-based character might get. However, there are other advantages that a faith-based character gets that offset that distinction. So, taking a magical trinket, if you are like an arcane caster, so to speak, is very, very good, especially if you invest a high die in that and you end up getting something like a D10 reagent. It means like you're just going to be casting spells left and right. If you do not have that, if you are an arcane caster and you do not have a reagent to help you out, you're going to be taking some serious HP cost to cast spells. I've done that. Like, I had a character in a series recently run by Richard Rain on Gauntlet Hangouts. We were playing in The Lost City by Tom Moldvay, and my character started out with 3 HP, and I was like riding that like 1 HP line for those first 2 sessions until I finally got a reagent. I got like a magical wand, and I was just like, okay, now it's time to cast spells. All right, and it's like, that's really exciting. It's a lot of fun. And that's just one way in which resource management is so interesting in this game. So continuing on, we have heirlooms and heritage. These are kind of a mixed bag, but they're mostly there to add flavor to your character and to help define who they are. There's a lot of sort of funny stuff. There's a lot of like interesting titles and that kind of thing you can come up with. It can be fairly strong in terms of fictional positioning, but really this is like the one go-to to have some interesting backstory added to your character. Just give you an idea of who they ought to be. And then finally, there's Faith. So I've already mentioned that Faith is kind of like divine casting, and if you take this one, the magical trinkets are not going to be valuable to you. Each Faith that you could roll defines like what you believe in, but it also gives you a risk die for casting magic. So your risk die for magic casting is directly tied to your faith, to your belief. So you might believe in something like, I just believe in Mother Nature, man. You get a D6 risk die. Or you might have, I have blinded myself in exchange for blessings from the eternal night. And you have a D10 risk die. These are used in special ways, which I will get into later in the review, because they have some differences from arcane casting or just standard magic casting. The next section is gear and gold. There's some equipment tables, nothing we need to look at. This is where we get into money in Macchiato Monsters, and this may be one of the most divisive aspects of the game. The money system in this game is fairly complex, and it does add to the interest of resource management. However, it also certainly adds to the cognitive load and the complexity of the game. So how does it work? In this system, you have coin types, which you should be familiar with from D&D. There's copper, silver, electrum, gold, platinum, and mythium, which is going from the least valuable to the most valuable. And then you have risk die for amounts of money or wealth, I guess you could say, because you do get items that have a certain monetary value assigned to them, but they are not themselves already coin, like metallic money. In order to buy something of a lesser value than an amount of money you have, you roll the risk die of that amount of money. So this you can think about kind of like how resources work in the Burning Wheel. You're, instead of having a set like amount of money, like I have 21 GP. No, instead you're going to have like a D6 of gold. And you can use that to buy anything worth less than D6 gold. You just roll on it, and if you roll a 1 to 3, then that would be stepped down to a D4 gold. So essentially, it's like in Burning Wheel, how if you fail your resources roll, then your resources get taxed. It makes it a more dynamic aspect of play rather than just having like, oh, I go from, it's like, oh, this counts, this costs 4 gold to purchase, so I go from 24 gold down to 20 gold. Like, there's no interest there. There's nothing dynamic about it. You just do the accounting, and then boom, you've got the thing that you want to buy, and that's the end of the story. In fact, this system actually introduces a lot of interesting choices in the way it interfaces with the equipment purchasing, but also with encumbrance. Because you can split, merge, and exchange bags of money. So merging money, you can merge 2 bags of equivalent value to get 1 bag of greater value. So you can take a D6 gold bag and a D6 gold bag, or like whatever else is worth gold D6, and combine them into a D8 gold bag. So why would you do this? You would do it because that means you go from using 2 item slots to using 1 item slot. And that is valuable in terms of encumbrance. Another reason why you might merge is because if you have 2 D12 of any coin type, you can merge those together and step up to the next coin type, which will give you access to better items. So you can aggregate all these little sums of money into like one big fund. And this is, again, it's very, very similar to the way this stuff works in Burning Wheel. And that's really cool, in my opinion, because that's a fun system. Another thing you can do is you can split one bag into 2 lesser value bags. So you can take a D8 of gold and split it into 2 D6 bags of gold. Again, why would you do this? The reason is because you can use that in terms of risk management. If you split off that D8 into 2 D6s, then if one of those D6s gets taxed down to a D4, you still have a D6 left for you. So that's another interesting decision. It's risk reward, like managing your finances in an interesting way. Or instead of splitting a bag to get a lesser value, you can also use that D8 to buy a bag of a lower coin type by rolling a higher coin type, right? So you say you roll D8 gold, and you can buy D8 Electrum with that. However, your D8 gold may be taxed, right? If you just split the gold, there is no tax involved. So it's really quite it's just a few rules. It's not super complicated, but there is some decision making. There is some weighing of benefits and risks. And I think that helps to make inventory management, resource management more interesting in this game. But of course, there are players for whom this will just they'll just look at it and they'll be like, nah, I don't. I just want this to be simple, and this is just complicating things so much. So one reason why you might argue for using these different coin types in the game is because it improves compatibility with old OSR modules. But there are newer OSR modules like the Ultraviolet Grasslands that just simplify down to one coin type, and then actually interfacing that module with Macchiato Monsters increases the complexity of using Macchiato Monsters, because you have to take the coin values in, say, Ultraviolet Grasslands and convert them into this multi-metallic money system. And so that is, it's like, yeah, it improves compatibility with old games or old modules. And in that sense, it's quite nice. However, there are newer modules that are trying to simplify the economy system, and this game is less compatible with those. So it's really, like, as I said, this is going to be a divisive part of the game for people. Some people will say it's a lot of complexity to no benefit. Other people will say that, it's good for compatibility, or it's just an interesting system in itself. Whether you find it interesting or not is kind of up to you. I can certainly envision a system that tries to simplify this down to one money type, but I'm not super interested in developing that system myself. If somebody else has heard of something like that, then certainly feel free to post in the comments. It may be of interest to some people who are watching. Okay, so that's money. That's one of the big ones for this game. Finally, in this section, we have encumbrance, which is very simple. Thankfully, this part is simple. Your hero can comfortably carry one item per point of constitution. So you get one item slot per point of constitution. So again, this means if you do spend a point of constitution to re-roll your hit die, you are also reducing the number of items you can carry. So it's really interesting how these systems interface with each other in terms of making your decisions. But yeah, You can carry up to your constitution in terms of items, and you will not be encumbered, but you can carry up to your strength plus your constitution in item slots, and you will be encumbered. But that's your absolute max of carrying capacity. If you are encumbered, then of course you get disadvantage on some rolls, and that's the way that's handled. You also move slower. You normally move at 40 kilometers per day over land, and maybe you are reduced to 20 kilometers per day if you're encumbered. That is the kind of thing this works out to. Okay, so the next section here is experience and goals. This is another interesting aspect of this game. Advancement is not driven by how much treasure you get or how many milestones you've hit. It is a system that is goal driven, and that those goals are established in conversation between the referee and the players. So there's two types of goals in this system. You're going to have party goals and personal goals. Party goals are things that everybody in the group is trying to accomplish, and personal goals are things that just individual characters are trying to accomplish. You get advancement for both. Generally, these tend to be quite practical things, but I find that the party goals tend to be a little more abstract. The personal goals tend to be very concrete. Like the personal goal could be like find ammunition for my gun. That could be a personal goal. A party goal might be find evidence of the passing of the dragon or something like that. The interesting thing here is that I think they do add quite a bit of motivation to PCs, and they also allow for the players to sort of take stock of what's happening in the game, reflect on what they're trying to accomplish, and have some conversations about that, and I find that to be quite interesting. Beyond that, it's interesting that this goal system works very well even in highly procedurally generated scenarios. Like I was playing this game with the Gardens of Yin, which is almost entirely procedurally generated. There's no clear track to it at all, and people were still able to establish and hit goals and still continue to level up. So that sort of dialogue between narrativizing and randomizing seems to work out pretty well with this system, and I like that a whole lot. It's very cool. So how does leveling up work? You level up when you have accomplished a number of goals equal to the value of your current level. So if you're level 1, you accomplish one goal, you're level 2. Yay! If you accomplish more goals than you need to level up, then those accomplishments roll over to your next level. So what can you do when you level? Your choices are not quite the same as when you create a character. You can choose to add 1 point to a stat of your choice. You can gain 1 hit die of the same type. You can research a new spell, but you cannot take magic training except at levels 4, 7, and 10. At those levels, you can take a new type of training or a new trait. But normally, you can just choose a new spell if you already have taken magic training. You can gain a melee or missile attack if you took martial training, and you can gain a new daily ability and an extra use of an old one if you took specialist training. So those choices you make at character creation are actually consequential down the road, and there's a little bit of an unevenness to the power curve, which increases the interest, and that's something which players of, say, kind of trad RPGs like D&D 5e, 4e, Pathfinder, 13th Age, all of those games, you will be familiar with that kind of uneven power curve and how interesting that can be for your character advancement throughout the game. So this system is very light, very simple, but it does provide a little bit of that flavor to play, and that's pretty cool. So the next section is monsters and followers. And this kicks off with the basic rules for creatures and other hostiles, like whatever is called monsters, just anything hostile to the party. The conversion from existing stat blocks in other OSR stuff or in just any D&D stuff is pretty simple. It's really quick and easy. I would just say read the rules if you're interested. I've had no difficulty in making the conversions. The only really noteworthy thing is that there are no monster magic rules. The players just make saving throws if it's required, or they roll the damage for how much damage they take. But you just use the damage as is written in whatever thing you're referencing, and boom, it's done. It's really easy. It's really simple, really fast. The next section here is a reaction table. Nothing too much to say here, but this reaction table uses risk dice, an encounter risk die. And that adds, the fact that all of these tables that follow are tied to one encounter risk die makes them interface with each other in really interesting ways. And it also provides its own sense of procedurally generated tension in play, because it is just as you're getting those 1 to 3 results, the tension is getting ramped up across the board. But if you roll the highest result, then boom, you get a little bit of relief across the board. It definitely adds to the cohesiveness of the play experience, because that encounter stat is being tracked across different situations. So you can also use it for motivation of monsters, which can be interesting if you're playing in a module where those things are very sparsely defined. Many modules will have clearly defined motivation, so you don't need to roll on that table. But hey, if it's useful, then go for it. There is also a morale table. This is probably something fairly familiar to most GMs who run OSR games. But the enemies have a morale risk die, and they become increasingly likely to break when their morale gets tested, and that's pretty cool, pretty interesting. The next section is about giving chase and running away. Very simple rules here. You lose stuff if you run away and fail your dex check. And that just kind of reminds me of Final Fantasy IV, how if you were running away from a battle, you could lose money. That's kind of, I'm sure that's a thing in other D&D games, but that's just what it reminded me of. And then when you are actually fleeing pursuit, you make constitution checks to evade, not dexterity checks. So that gives you, some more use out of constitution, and it just kind of suggests that, it's your endurance. If you are encumbered, then you're going to make those at disadvantage. The next section is followers or hirelings. These are all these are basically very similar to what you would find in other OSR games. They use a risk die for morale, just like monsters do. And you can step up the follower's risk die if you provide them with rewards, benefits, or make a charisma check. And this makes the relationship between the PCs and the followers more dynamic. And it kind of reminds me of some of the cooler stuff that Dungeon World and Worlds of Adventure does with followers. But yeah, nothing super interesting. It's just oh, that's cool. Okay, and then we're going to go on to the next big section of the game, which is exploring the world. So the first section here is about delving into dark places. So this is an encounter table that you would use in a dungeon, and again, it can interface with those reaction tables and everything. The higher you roll on the encounter risk die, the more likely it is that the players will get a good result. They'll get a find result, so they get like treasure or something. The lower you roll, the more likely it is that their resources will be taxed, or they'll get increasingly dangerous and severe encounter types. So very cool. Again, manages pacing. This encounter die can also be affected by player actions. So, for example, it says like if you're using black powder weapons, like if you're shooting a blunderbuss, it's likely it's going to trigger an encounter because hey, it's very loud and obvious. If the players are doing something very stealthy, then it might step up their encounter die and make things less dangerous. So yeah, I mean that's the rulings, not rules, right? It's just kind of up to the referee to decide. So the next section is crossing the wilderness. This is for overland travel. It's pretty similar. Doesn't seem anything. Or sorry, this is not a table. This is just rules for doing it. So yeah, it says if you are heavily armored, you move slower. If you are encumbered, you move slower, etc., 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 depending on terrain type and all this kind of thing. It's again, nothing unusual. This is like any OSR game you would find this. It's just nice to have it here. It's nothing too special. The next one is the weather system. Again, it uses a risk die. In my module, to the halls of the Stormlord, there's a lot of focus on weather because it's a Stormlord, right? There's storms. And I use this idea quite extensively and had a lot of fun with it. It's really cool that the weather gets worse and worse, like the lower you roll on the table. Then there is wilderness exploration. It's like very similar to the dungeon exploration table. Nothing like, it's just a little tweaked. Has some stipulations for terrain type. That's about it. Then you have hunting and foraging. You use the encounter risk die to see what you find when you're hunting or foraging. Again, these systems interface. So if you are out hunting, there's a chance you might end up in more dangerous encounters in the future. If you have a very low risk die currently, there's a chance you might end up in an encounter when you go hunting or foraging, so the stress, the tension ratchets up. And the camp events also use the encounter die. So boom, that's cool too. Now, the final part here is about shortcuts. So these are for fast-forwarding play and reintroducing characters. These are kind of similar to like this. So the fast-forwarding play kind of reminds me of Undertake a Perilous Journey from Dungeon World. And the catching up with the party is kind of like the love letter system that some PBTA games use. But these are fun. They're kind of cool. Like if you can't come up with a good idea yourself, you just roll on the table. Boom, it helps out. It's interesting. And again, these rely on the encounter risk die. So it's like, wow, the encounter risk die is tied to so much stuff. It's pretty amazing. Okay, so let's talk about combat. So fights and how to avoid them. In this game, there are a lot of tactics. But tactics are about what you do before combat. It's about stacking advantages going into combat, not what you do after you engage in combat. The tactical options once you engage in combat are quite limited. They're not non-existent, but they're limited. But the options before getting into combat are very consequential. So games like Gloomhaven, games like modern D&D, and so on, they have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of combat rules, and they really focus on like the tactics of like forming a line and flanking and all that kind of stuff in very like prescribed, clear ways, using special abilities. Like each one has a different stat block and they have different rules. Like you especially see this in like the new Pathfinder edition. It's like, wow, this is like so elaborate. This is very simple, But I find that if you're playing this game with a lot of intention and you're thinking tactically, you can set up interesting tactical situations just the same way you might in a much more elaborate game. So, for example, I was playing in The Lost City in Richard Rain's game, and I got a map. I was like, "Oh, I got a map! Cool! Like I can see the layout of the enemy territory basically in this dungeon, right? Like, oh, what are the entrances? What are the exits?" Well, based on analyzing that map, I realized that there was only one entrance and exit to the enemy base. And so I was like, well, like, let's just use fire and like burn them all to death or smoke them all to death. They won't be able to escape. If they try to escape, we'll form a line and we'll shoot them dead. It's a pretty vicious way of doing things, but it was very effective. And the reason it was so effective is because I set up the advantages going into combat, not once we actually got there. So there is a lot of tactical thinking you can do. You just have to think about it using your intelligence before you get there. So that's one thing I would say about combat in this game. The actual combat itself is very simple. It's even simpler than some other OSR games. So how does it work? The PCs take their turns. Monsters usually only attack when the PCs fail rolls. But if the monster didn't get to act because as a reaction to a PC failure, then they can do an attack themselves. So that's kind of how initiative works. But there is no initiative roll. You just use common sense based, like the referee uses common sense based on who would probably act first in the situation, who has the jump on the other team. There's no grid-based movement in action at all. There's not even optional rules for it. It's just not even there. So like I said, the actual combat itself is not very complex. There's a lot of use of advantage and disadvantage. If you are attacking higher hit dice monsters, it means you have disadvantage. That's similar to many other OSR games. However, you can gang up on them. If the total player team hit dice, including your followers, is equal to or greater than the monster team hit dice, then your disadvantage on attacking is canceled. So there's an advantage to having numbers, which can help to counteract having like a really strong enemy that you face. So that's kind of interesting. Not super complicated, but it does add something. Another rule is the tactical risks. So what this basically does is it lets you make a roll to get an advantage down the line, but if you fail, you're going to have a disadvantage. So it's like, doing something risky. It's like, oh, I'm gonna try to get the flank on the enemy, but this is gonna leave me temporarily exposed. Do I do it or do I not? Oh, I did it. I get the flank and I have advantage in the next attack. No, I didn't do it. I was caught out and now I'm at disadvantage. I got to get to cover, like that kind of thing. It's very, very simple. And then complex turns is one other thing you can do. This is if the player is trying to do something very elaborate that would involve a number of actions in a single turn. You can roll 1d20 for each for the number of actions you're trying to do, and then you can assign your dice results to each thing that you're doing. So, for example, if you're trying to if you are trying to like decipher a magic inscription and also reload your crossbow in a turn, then you can roll 2d20 and assign your dice to the ones that you want to succeed or fail at. It just adds a little bit of tension, a little bit of decision making. And that's basically the combat rules. Like you attack using strength for melee weapons and dexterity for ranged weapons. And I don't know. There's like most of the time the combat is not going to end in everybody dying. It's going to end in one side breaking because of morale failing and running away. And running away is often a good option because this is not a system balanced or weighted towards your success in combat. You have to make those advantages for yourself if you really, really, really want to go to a fight. So the next section is wounds and death. So the rules for dying in this game, if you hit 0 hit points, you make a constitution check. If you succeed, you go to 1 hit point, but you lose a level. And that means losing advances, right? Like you lose the benefits of your previous level. If you fail your constitution check, you're dead. That's it. Boom. So I mean, obviously there's value to having a high constitution score in that sense. Constitution does a lot of work for you. It's not a dump stat. When you are resting, you roll your food risk die and regain HP equal to that result. So if you don't have food, even if you're resting, you're not going to be recovering hit points. Magical healing in this game, it costs the caster 3 hit points, and it heals at most 1d8 damage. So you cannot abuse it to just sort of negate the tension of hit point depletion. And like D&D 5e, this system uses long rests, but when they say long rests, they mean like really long rests, like a couple days. And those really do allow you to recover your risk dice, to re-roll your hit dice, and so on. Like it's like a full recovery, but it takes a couple days of rest. It's not something you can just do in like 5 hours or something like that. I forget what the exact number of hours is in D&D. So now we go to spells and chaos, another interesting system. So how does magic work in this game? To begin with, it's a level-less system. There are no spell levels. And spells cost hit points according to the degree of their effect. So there's a little table here, kind of similar to what you might find in like Blades in the Dark, in terms of figuring out how much hit points each spell should cost the caster. And the player and the referee can kind of negotiate that out together. As I said previously, if you have magic reagents, like a magic wand or something, you can use that to negate the HP cost. You roll on your reagent, and it basically soaks as many HP casting damage as you roll on that die. If you roll under the amount of HP you took, damage you took, then it will, like, so for example, I am casting a 3 HP healing spell. I roll a 2. My reagent's going to step down a step in terms of its durability, right? And I'm also going to take 1 HP damage because it overflowed what the reagent did for me. So pretty simple, nothing too hard to track. I do find that, if you're a player who has a little bit of analysis paralysis and has some trouble coming up with spells, you may want to look to a spell list in some other game to help give you some inspiration, because some players will have some challenges with just kind of coming up with spells on the fly off the top of their head. And there's really not much to support you in this game. So that might be something, if you are refereeing this game, if you're running this game, you may want to bring with you to the session as having a spell list for players to work from. I recommend the one from Knave. It's pretty cool. And it's free. Maze Rats is another one you could use, our creation system. But, it's OSR. You just kind of pick and choose, mix and match as you like. Yeah, and if you fail a spell roll, you can succeed if you roll on the chaos table. So yeah, this is chaos magic. It's like wild magic. It does weird stuff, and there's a chaos risk die you can use to track sort of the degree of weirdness in the area, which is something that if any of you have played Slumbering Ursine Dunes, you may be familiar with that concept, because it does that too. And you could interface those things in an interesting way, right? Use the same chaos risk die. It's fun. Now we can talk about faith. So faith casting. Faith allows for casting spells, just like if you had a reagent. You can roll your faith die, and it can soak damage for you. Additionally, players can use it to get advantage on a roll in line with their religion. You have to roll the faith risk die to see if it steps down. You can heal HP by meditating for an hour. The amount is determined by your faith risk die. You can absorb damage if you are unarmored. So you can't use it in the place of armor if you are wearing armor, but you can use it in the place of armor if you're completely unarmored. So that could lead to some fun character creation. Just be like, yeah, I'm just wearing normal clothes. I have no armor at all, but my faith protects me. It's very fun. And the thing about it's a little different here is that you can step up your faith risk die either by doing something that is in line with your religion of some significance, or by taking magic training again at your level up. That will step it up again too. So you can only have one faith. So if you are an arcane caster, you could have more than one reagent, and that would give you more casting capacity. But faith also allows you to do more things. It's more useful for that one die you have. It's just like, there's a balance there between arcane casting and divine casting, which is pretty cool. This is quite flavorful. There are crafting rules for magic items. I mean, just, look it up if you're interested. Drugs and intoxication. There are risk dies for drugs, of course. Again, you can look that up if you're interested. And then there are just some extra tables and rules in the game. I'm not going to go through all of them. I will talk a little bit about the monster list here. I didn't use it very much personally in games, but it was really useful for me to clarify the rules, just to see what a stat block looks like. And also, when I was writing my own module for this game, To the Halls of the Stormlord, having this model to work off of was really helpful for just building out very simple monster stat blocks. There are some rules here for helping with running open-ended campaigns. I haven't done any open-ended campaigns with this game. I've only done pre-written modules with this game. So that is an aspect of the game I'd like to explore more. I just haven't done it yet. If you look down here, you can see there's all kinds of rolling tables to just get random townspeople or whatever you might have. I can imagine any number of different situations in which this might be useful. If you were playing a more urban fantasy game, I could see these plots and townspeople being super useful. But I have not used them myself, so I can't really speak to their quality. And there are mass combat rules, which I have used quite a bit. And they basically involve assigning a risk die to each side, rolling them over a series of rounds, and the side that runs out first, that their risk die expires first, loses and are destroyed. Driven off or destroyed, I guess you could say. Character actions on the battlefield can give advantage to their side's risk die. And it's just a very simple system, but it works. I experience it works. It's interesting. You never know which one's going to come out ahead because there's a lot of randomness involved. but it's weighted randomness, and that makes it fun. All right, so my conclusions about this game. I think, as I've said, it's a very fun OSR game. It's my favorite OSR game I've played so far. I really like how it handles inventory management, resource management, how the systems are brought together by the risk dice, and how it's really friendly for doing a lot of procedural generation, which is something as a GM or as a referee that I really like to do myself. I've also found it has had pretty good compatibility with other modules. I mentioned that, if the module only uses a singular currency unit, it can be a little more difficult to convert over to Macchiato Monsters. But for older modules that have different types of currency, it is a little more friendly for converting in that sense. The sticking point for a lot of people is going to be the openness of character creation, right? There's a lot of player decisions to be made, and that can cause analysis paralysis. The length of character creation and the complexity of the money system. I feel like those are the things that people are going to split on in terms of whether they like the game or they don't like the game. But for me, it's a really great middle ground between something extremely light and something heavier, like trad games like the modern D&Ds and so on. So those are my thoughts about Macchiato Monsters. I really hope you have found this informative and enjoyable. And I hope you check out this game, and if you do, let me know what your experiences are. I think it's a fantastic piece of work, and definitely deserves attention. So thanks, and I will see you later with another video.